In this video, I'm going to be going over Class Activity 11, Exam 2 Review, Quiz Part 1. All right, so this quiz is going to contain 8 multiple choice questions, 2 matching, 3 short coding questions, and 1 longer coding question. And this is recommended for you to try as much without referencing code, just from memory. Now, the first attempt at this was just for participation in class, just to check to see if you're understanding the content. You are allowed to have multiple attempts for this quiz. And so you'll be able to practice it as many times as you need for the exam. So the first thing I'm going to do is click on Take the Quiz. All right. And so this quiz is giving you about 30 minutes to complete the following questions. So the very first thing we're going to look at is, what will the output of the following code be? We have our for loop, and it says for I in range of 4, and we're printing out I. Now, in Python, that range with the value or that number in the parentheses is going to give us 0 through 4. So that's just going to be 4 minus 1. So it's actually going to give us 0, 1, 2, and 3. And so if you clicked on 0, 1, 2, and 3, you were correct for this question. Again, because the range here is not including the value for, or the number 4 here. It's going from 0, the default value, to 3, which will give us the 4 numbers. All right. The next question we're going to be looking at is, what will be printed by this loop? We have for I in range, and our starting point is at 2. Our stopping point is at 10, and it looks like we're stepping over 3. So in the previous, remember, whenever we're dealing with range, there is a default starting point of 0 and a default stepping point of 1. And so that's why we only needed to put 4 inside of that range, because we know that it's going to start from 0 and increment or add 1 to that number each time until we get up to 4, and then we're done. So in this case, we know it's going to start at 2, so we can deduce that this is not the correct answer. And then we also know that we're going to end at 10, but not include 9, or not include 10. So it's not inclusive as exclusive. And then we know we're going to step over every 3. So in this case, since it begins at 2 and it increases by 3, the number that is going to be displayed out to us is actually going to be 2. And then when we add 3 to 2, we get 5. Then when we add 3 to 5, we get 8. And when we add 3 to 8, we get 9, 10, 11. But since 11 isn't even included in here, we know that it's going to stop at 8. So in that case here, we have this is the correct answer. Why it can't be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? Because we're incrementing by 3 and not by 1. Why can't it be 2, 4, 6, 8? Because we're not incrementing by 2, we are incrementing by 3. So hence why we have 2, 5, 8. Next question here. What keyword is used to exit a loop in Python? So we know we've not seen stop before. We know that end we usually use in our print statements, and we're assigning to it some blank space to give a space in between each print. And we know that we have not used quit other than asking for the user to type in Q to quit. So if you deduce these 3 answers here, you'll look at break and remember, oh, we've used break in while loops, we've used break statement inside of if statements, and we've used break statements in a lot of other concepts as well. Oh, I already said while loop, so we used it already there. So break is the correct answer for number 3. The next question that we're going to get to is question number 4. What will be printed by this loop? We set we assign 0 to I, then we have our while loop, and we're saying while true, so whatever is inside of this is going to keep on running until that true is no longer accurate. Then we're actually going to print out I. So the first thing that's going to print out is 0 because we've already assigned 0 to I. Then it says here in our if statement, if I is equivalent to 3, then we're going to break. And then underneath that if statement, we are incrementing by 1. And if you remember for this, it's just I equals I plus 1, or this is shorthanded version, just I plus equals 1. So in this case here, we know that it's going to display out 0. So we can get rid of this answer and get rid of this answer because we do see a break statement here to break out of this while loop, and we know that this condition will get met because we have an incrementation here. So we can take out those two items, the first and last items. Now, when we look at these first two or these middle two items, we know the first one's going to be 0, but if we trace through this code and we add 1 to it, we know the next one's going to be 1. We trace through the code again, we add to it, the next one's going to be 3. We iterate this through again, and then we see, okay, I is actually equivalent to 3, so it's already broken out of this if statement in the previous loop, so we know that we're only going to go up to 3 and not include 4 because this break statement was executed before we even incremented I to 4. So we're going to click on 0, 1, 2, and 3. Next question. We have question number 5. And this one says, what will be the output of this loop with an else clause? So we have for I in range of 2. So we know that it's going to go from 0 to 2, not including 2. And we are also by default going to be incrementing by 1. So the first one is going to print out I as 0. Then the second one is going to print out I as 1. Then we're going to look at this else clause real quick, and it says print loop complete. So this else statement is underneath the for loop. So that means that in order for us to see it, this for loop has to be terminated. So once we print out I as 0, I as 1, we know that it's going to increment I to 2. And because that 2 meets our stopping point, it will break out of this for loop and not even print out I as 2. So we know it's only going to print out I as 0 or 1. So we know these two are wrong answers. Now, when we get to the else statement, we know after that has been executed, it's just going to print out loop complete. So in this case, we know that the best choice and the correct answer is actually going to be 0, 1, and loop complete. So this is the correct answer. Now we're going to move on to question number 6. What is the result of swapping variables? So here we know when we assign these values on the same line, that x is going to be assigned to, or 5 is going to be assigned to x. And we know that 10 is going to be assigned to y. Now, with that being said, on the next line here, we now see that we've swapped. So we're going to assign the value 10 that's stored in y to x, and we're going to assign the value 5 that's stored in x to y. So when we print out x, that one we know is actually going to be 10. So we can deduce that this is wrong, this is wrong, and this is wrong. So even just by not understanding concepts, you can click on this. But if you understand how this works, if x is assigned to 5 first and 10 is assigned to y, and then when we assign y to x, we're first saying x is now going to hold the value 10. And then now we're going to say whatever was in x prior, which was 5, or which was 5, is now going to be assigned to y. So we now know that we're going to see 5 and 10, or 10 and 5, as the correct answer here. So this is the best choice. And this is called tuple unpacking, or in Python, tuple unpacking, where we're swapping in one line the values that are being stored. Now we're going to move on to question number 7. Now, question 7 says, what will be the output of the following function call? So we've defined a function called compute. We've passed in some value 4 in this case. And then in the the second and third parameter, we're assigning 2 to B. So this is a default value. And then we're also assigning 3 to C, which is another default value. So here, when we call compute passing in 4, we are assigning 4 to A. Because we didn't pass in any other values, we didn't pass in a second or third argument here, what's actually going to happen is the default value of B assigned to 2 is going to be stored in 2. So we have 4 plus 2, which is 6. And then we're also know that C is the default value. So we're going to add on top of 6 to 6, 3. And so we know now what's going to return to this function call is going to be 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's going to be 9. Whoops. Yes, 9. I just said 9. Just wanted to check to make sure. All right. Yeah, it's going to be 9 because we're adding 4, then 2, then 3. And it returns that in our print statement here. All right. Next question. Here we're actually looking at what will be the output of the following code here, or the following function call. So we see here that S, we have a set here, 1, 2, and 3, and we're removing 5 here. And then we're printing out S. There's an issue here. The program is trying to print out S, but we're also trying to remove the value 5. So in this one section here, we would know that there has to be some sort of key error here. And that's just because when we remove X, it's going to throw a key error, because if X is not actually in that set, we're going to use that discard X to avoid any errors. And this is just going to remove, or it's going to say that there is a key error that is being raised. So out of the 4 choices here, this is not an empty set because we know that it has 3 values. The set here remains unchanged, but that's not the case because we're not trying to modify anything. It's not printing out 1, 2, and 3 here because essentially this removal of 5 is going to throw an error because there is no 5 there. So we know that it's going to raise a key error. And you guys have seen this at least once or twice earlier in the semester when we went through the code with me of showing what would happen when you remove a value from the set and it's not there. So hopefully that you understood that process there. The next question that we're going to be looking at is matching. So the first thing it says, we're going to match the data structure with its appropriate characteristics. So let's see what data structures we're looking at. We're looking at lists, tuples, sets, and dictionaries. So the first one is we're adding an item using add. What function or what data structure uses .add as a function? If you don't know that, it's fine. We can move on, but I will go ahead and say it is set. But we'll move on to the next one so that we can kind of deduce what we do know. So in this next section here, when we move on to the next question, when it talks about accessing elements via an index, we know we've done this a plethora of times with lists. So we know that this is the correct answer. The next thing we're going to look at is immutable, and it allows for duplicates. So let's see here. What allows for duplicates? Out of the 3 that were not selected, we know that sets are meant to be unique. Tuples can be coordinates, and there are duplicates of that we could have, or it allows for duplicates of those, and it's also something that is not changeable. But let's say we don't know what that is. Let's say we have no clue what it is. We know that it's not set, but it could be dictionary or tuple. Let's move on to the next question. Here it says key value pair assignment. So we do know what this is here. We do know that there is a key value pair and it's with dictionary. So we can click on that because in every dictionary, there is a key and there is a value. So now when we go back to this, we know it's not dictionary and we know it's not set, so we know that it's going to be a tuple. But I would highly recommend if you don't understand these two that you look at the study guide and also the cheat sheet that was given to you in the past that you could download from past modules and get a better understanding of these data structures. So we know that here adding an item using .add would be for a set. All right, so in this case, for some of this is either you know it or not, and since these are the 4 data structures that we will be using and have used throughout the semester, it's just important that you understand different concepts. So go back to your Xi books or go back to the Code with Me or any of the activities that we've used, lists, tuples, and dictionaries. All right, next question here. The next question is asking us to match the term with the description when we're looking at functions. So first things first, when we look at def, I know a lot of people were able to answer this question correctly. We know what it defines. It defines a function. So we're going to look here and we're going to see where it defines a function. So it's used to define a function in Python, so we'll click on that. The next question here is parameter. What is a parameter? When we're looking at a function, we know the variable listed inside of the parentheses is a function definition that accepts a value. This is a parameter. And if you don't know that, when you look at these functions here, like this one here, these are parameters. We have A, B, and C. These are parameter values. We also have, I think there's another function further up here, maybe not. Okay, in the other quiz there is one, but this specific one shows that these are parameter values here. All right, and so then the next thing we're going to look at is arguments. So an argument is going to be the literal value here. So this is a value that you give to a function when you're calling it. And so we can see here in this function alone, this 4 is the argument that is being passed into the compute function and being assigned to these parameters here. All right. Now the next question, a return. Sends a value back from a function to where it was called. That is true of a return. It does send a value back from the function to where it was called. Now, the next question we're going to look at is what is a break? And there was a question up above where we looked at what a break does. So we see it ends a loop immediately, even if the condition is still true. So we're going to click on that because we know that that is true. A break ends a loop immediately, even if the condition is still true. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is what is continue? So continue skips the rest of the current loop iteration and moves to the next one. That's what continue does. But let's see if there are any other options. Let's see. Okay, there are no other options, so we know that this is correct. So now we're going to move on to pass. So we see that pass, and we know that pass is something that is a placeholder because we've used it in the Code with Me 4 as well as in Code with Me 5. We can place it in functions that we're just creating the header for and don't really know what to add into it. So yes, it does nothing and it acts as a placeholder. The very last thing we're looking at is a function call. So what is a function call? It executes a defined function using its name followed by a parentheses. And that is correct. So that is a function call. And you can see that even here where we're calling compute, passing in 4 as an argument, and that gets assigned to the parameter A And then the return returns the results of the sum of a plus b plus c in this function that is defined as compute. So already, if you paid attention to question 7, you've hit function call, you've hit argument, you've hit parameter, you've hit defining a function, and you've hit returning a value. And so you see you've already answered 5 questions out of the 8 that are here, if you understood the one prior. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next section here. We're going to print the first numbers between 1 and 50 that is divisible by 5 and 7. So what does that actually look like to us? So in this case here, if we're wanting to print out the questions or the first number between 1 and 50 that is divisible by 5 and 7, what we're actually going to do here is the first thing we're going to do is have a for loop. So we know that that's going to give us our range or our sequence of numbers from 1 to 50. So first thing I'm going to do is for n in, or I'll just do num, for num in range, and we're going to start with 1, comma, and because I wanted to include 50, I could do one of two things. I could do 50 plus 1 here. I could add an expression as the second parameter, or I could just do 51. So here I'm just going to do 51. So from the number ranging from 1 to 51, then we're just going to tab over, and in this case, I'm just going to do 4 spaces because the tab is 4 spaces. 4. And then here I'm going to start my if statement because in this case, I can really decipher the difference between what is divisible by 5 and 7. So I'm going to say if num, and we're going to use the modulo symbol, is divisible by 5, and the remainder is going to be 0. And we're looking at the remainder whenever we're looking at modulos. And this is because whenever we have, for example, 25 divided by 5, there is no remainder. So we know that if num is divisible by 5 and the remainder of this expression here is equivalent to 0, then we know that the number that is in the code that we execute within that if statement means that that number is divisible by 5. But we're not done yet. We still have to do and 7. So what we're going to do here is include and we're going to say num, and we're going to say modulos 7, and then we're going to say is equivalent to 0 here. Now this 0 is doing this section is doing the same thing that the first section is doing, but the difference is we are using our and operator here to include both statements. We want both num divisible by 5 to be equivalent to 0, and we want both num modulo, not divisible, modulo 7 with the remainder of 0 equivalent to 0. So we know that that is correct. And in this case, we're going to have to do 8 spaces. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And now we know that we're indented in correctly within this statement. So now the next thing for us to do is to print out I. And now we have printed out I here. And so what's going to happen is that when this function or when this code is executed, it's going to print the first number between 1 and 50 that is divisible by 5 and 7. But will it actually print out the first number, or will it print out all of the numbers? We know that it's going to print out all of the numbers because of the for loop. So what statement can we put at the end of this print, or at the end of this line here, to allow for our for loop to stop? And if you remember in the past, in our matching statement, we see that break ends a loop immediately. So if we want to only print out the first number, we're going to put break here after it prints out the very first item. And this is the code for question 11. We have our for loop, our if statement, our print I, and our break to allow for only one number to get displayed. All right. Now the next question. See how many minutes I have here. 6 minutes. I have 6 minutes to get through. 2, 3, 4. Hey Siri, set an alarm for 4 minutes. All right. So now the next question we are actually going to be looking at is this question 12. So it says update the value of X in the following dictionary to 15 and print the updated dictionary. So now we're on 12. We're going to look at this a little bit more subjectively. So we want to update where X is, and we want to update the value to be 15. Now we have run through this a plethora of times with the virtual pet simulator, both front and back. So hopefully you both understand or you understand this concept a little bit better. So we know to be able to access our dictionary here, and we want to be able to update the value. We're going to place inside of here the key that we're wanting to update. So we know we want to update X. And then we're going to use our assignment operator here and just assign 15, the value, to wherever X is. So this is going to be used to update 5 to now be 15. This is similar to when we updated the grid wherever the food position was or the toy position was. Very similar to that. So if you have done lab 6, class activity 9, and even the first project, you would have a better understanding of what to do for this question. So now we're going to move on to question number 13 here. So in this case, what we're actually saying is we want to define a function called process underscore number. So we're going to define it, say process underscore numbers. We're going to pass in a parameter and we're going to call it numbers and a colon. Then we're going to give our 4 spaces. And it says that prints all positive numbers, but skips negatives using continue. So the very first thing that we know we want to do is have a range of numbers. So we're going to use our for loop. For every num in range, or in this case, we're going to assume that numbers is a list of numbers because that's all we're given is numbers. So for this one, you can approach it in the best possible way that you can understand it. So if we say for every num in numbers as the list here, then we're going to give another 8 spaces. There we go. And now in this statement, I'm going to try to find a way to actually just make sure that numbers is actually going to be only positive numbers. So we're saying, and this is one easy way, you could also use modulus if you wanted to, but we're going to say if num is less than 0, simple. Don't work harder, work smarter. If num is less than 0, meaning a negative number, hey, we want to continue. Otherwise, what we're going to do, and we don't have to use an else statement here, we can just do a print. We're just going to print out num. And then the very last thing that it wants us to do is underneath the for loop here, we're going to just print out processing complete. Right? All right, so we have finished question number 13. So it's not asking you to it's asking you to think a little bit critically here. What is the best way for you to approach this without hurting your brain? This is the best logical answer at the present. So we use continue to skip the rest of the loop, the body for the iteration, and it moves to the next item. How many more times do we have left? We have 1 minute. I can do this in 1 minute. Let's get going. All right. Very last question here. We are about to define 2 functions. So I'm going to go ahead and define main. And then I'm also going to go ahead and define describe underscore person here. All right. And inside of main, it looks like we're going to call this function that we've just created. So again, follow it line by line instead of trying to do things a little bit harder. We're going to call it. So you've already done step 2 here. Now the next thing it says is to pass in 3 arguments. So what we're going to do is pass in the literal value Jason, comma, 30, which is an integer, comma, New York, which is a string. And then it says in describe person, we're going to take 3 parameters. So we're going to put in here 3 parameter values, name, age, and city. Then inside of this function here, what we're going to do, tab over 4 spaces, and we're going to use our F string. So we're going to do print F quotes here, and we're just going to print out some message containing all of this value. And let me... All right, and then what we're going to do inside of here is we have to now see, oops, yep, we have to now see, now that we've taken in those 3 parameters, that those 3 arguments are here. Now the next thing it says to print a sentence describing the person. So here I'm just going to put placeholder, I'm going to zoom in a bit, and here we're just going to put name, and we're going to just say in front of open close curly braces, hello name, you are, and we'll put age here, 30, and then it would be years, old, period. Are you from, and then we'll put here city, question mark, would you like to play a game? All right, and so in this case here, we do have our print statement, and then it says to run the main function. So what that means is we're going to be calling the main function. So for this one, you don't have to use any of that if underscore name, using that entry point. You could just do a function call here, but either or works perfectly fine. So we see here we have 2 separate functions. We're passing in an argument when we call describe person, and then it's going to be assigned to the parameters within the describe underscore person function, and we're just going to use a format string, passing in the name, age, and city as a placeholder. All right, so we're going to move on to the very last question here, question number 15, and this is a more scenario-based question. So it says a small business owner wants a simple program to store computer information for their company. They need to input multiple customer details, including their name, age, and city. The program should store the data in a dictionary, use numerical keys, and print all stored information in a structured format. So the first thing we're going to look at is just the first step. So we're going to define a function. You don't have to because it didn't express it. You do as much as you can in terms of code, but I'm going to define the function and call it collect underscore customers. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then inside of here, what we're going to use is a dictionary to store the customer data. So we know that we're going to have to get that information. So we're just going to create an empty dictionary called data here. And how we create an empty dictionary, we have the name and we have the open close curly braces here. Then the next thing we're going to do on this line is we're going to input the information from the user. So I'm just going to put user underscore number, and I'm going to assign to this the input function here, or the return value from the input function here. And then I'm going to ask how many customers do you, and let me just make sure, how many customers do you want to enter? Question mark. Quotes. There we go. And we're going to close that statement with the parentheses. But since they're entering a number and this is returning to us an integer value, and we know that later on we're actually going to use that integer value for our for loop to iterate through, we are actually going to go ahead and cast the input as an integer. So we're going to do int, open parentheses, and then closing parentheses. So what's happening here is it's returning the string from the input, and then it's going to convert that, and then we're going to convert that to an integer, and that's going to be what gets stored in user underscore num. All right. And so now that we have that statement there, the next line of code that we're going to write is going to be our for loop. And that's because we ask the user how many customers they want to enter, and we're going to prompt for the name, the age, and the city for each customer. And we know we have to store this in a list and use a numeric key in the dictionary. So with that being said, if the person enters in 5 as the user input here, we know we're going to use a for loop. So we're going to say for I in range, and we're going to put in the range user underscore num. And we know that this is going to include 0, but exclude the value. So here, I'm just going to put a comment saying the value that we're going to be looking at here is going to be 4, right? So essentially, this is going to be for I in range of 4 here. And then we're going to indent in for 8 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, in this case with underneath the for loop. And the first thing we're going to do is prompt the user to enter in the data, but we're going to print out to the user, and I'm going to use fstring here. And I'm just going to say to the user, /m, customer hashtag, and I'm going to put in this area here my placeholder, and I'm going to do I+1, because again, remember, by default, it's starting at 0. I could put 0 here just to visually show you that we are starting at 0, but you don't need that there. So we're starting at 0. So if 0 is assigned to I the first time around, we know that this is going to be customer number 1 because it's 0 plus 1 in this expression. And then here, I'm just going to put a colon. And I'm just going to put in front of here, enter customer number 1. And here on the next line, I'm just going to place the variable name, and I'm going to assign to it input, and I'm just going to place in here, close the name, so that the user knows that they need to enter in the name. Then I'm going to do a new line here, and in fact, actually, because I want to keep it all on the same thing, shift new line. Okay, there we go. And then the next thing we're going to do is age, and we're going to assign to age input as well, but because we know age is going to be an integer, I want to make sure that I set it up right. So I'm going to do int open parentheses and make sure that you have a closing parentheses at the end of that statement. So inside of the input here, what we're going to do is we're going to have age, colon, quote, because we're still prompting the user to enter in data. Then the very next thing we're going to do is also ask the user to enter in their city. So we're going to do city equals, and then we're going to have the input here. Now, in this case here, we're going to close it up, and inside of the input, we're just going to put city here. Okay, and we know that's going to return a string, so we don't have to convert it. Now, the next step that we have to have, and we also need to make sure it's still indented in, is the next step. So we prompted the user for the name, age, and city for each customer. Now we need to store the details in a list using a numeric key in the dictionary. So what that means is we already have a dictionary, but the next step that we have to do is actually just store it based off of the for loop variable that is keeping track of the numbers. So in the same way that we're saying, okay, enter customer number 1, and then the next iteration will be number 2. We're going to do the same thing as the key to the data. So essentially what should be stored in here, we will have data as the dictionary, and we're having our open close square brackets. And the first thing we're going to add in here is we're going to say I plus 1. So the first thing that's going to get in here is 1. So essentially what's happening here is the key is going to be 1, and then we're going to have a colon, and then we're going to have a list. And let's say we add in the same information that we had above. We have Jason, then we have the age of 30, then we have this city, New York City. That is essentially how that first section of the dictionary is going to get stored. Then it's going to run it again, and it's going to do 2, colon. So it's going to have 2 being the key, and then the value is going to be the list. So it's going to be, let's say we use Robin, then comma 22, then comma Muncie. So that is the structure of how those values are going to get updated into the dictionary. So in this case here, we have our first value, which is the key. And now we also need to make sure that we assign the value. And since that's going to be in a list form, we know we're going to need to create an empty list, and this is how we do it. But we now need to add in the values that we want to store it in. So we know that name is first, we know age is second, and we know city is next. So this is how we go about actually adding in the number with the value. So we see here that this is the first part. So we've stored the details in a list using numerical keys in the dictionary. Now it says print the data as a key value pair using the values to access and display each detail. Now for me, I like to structure it in separate functions that each function does something small. So this one is just collecting the customer. Now I'm going to define another function here, and I'm going to call it printing the customer. You do not have to do this if it's more time sensitive for the test, but it is best practice when you're actually coding to do stuff like this, where each function does one task. So in this case here, we're going to pass in, we know we want to take in the dictionary, so we're going to pass in data as a parameter. The next step, 1, 2, 3, 4, is to tab over. And the first thing we're going to do is actually go through each item within that dictionary. And if you remember, there is a way for us to associate each key and value together using dictionaries. So we say for key, which is K, and value inside of our data dictionary here. And we're going to get access to the dictionary function called items. So it's going to group all of those items together, and we're going to see the key value associated to that. So what it's saying is for every key and value inside of our data and grouped in those items, Now we're wanting to print out that information here. So what we're going to do is use our printf. Let me close and then put F in front of the quotes. Then inside of the quotes here, we're going to place in, for example, we'll just put K as the first placeholder and put a colon here. And then we're going to do name equals. And here we're going to put our second placeholder and we're just going to put V. And in this case here, what we're going to do is just display out the first item within that in that value, and that's going to be 0. And then we're going to do the same thing next. So we're going to have a name, and then we're going to have comma next to it. And then on this end, we're just going to have, I believe it's age is next. So we're going to have age equals. And you see how we're using list indexing to access the first item, which is name, because when you add this, it is adding it with the number being the key and the list being the value. So in order to access name, it has to be at index 0. In order to access age, it has to be at index 1. In order to access city, it has to be at index 2. So here, we're going to have our placeholder, open, close curly braces, making sure that we use V as the value, and we're going to say 1 for age here. Open, close square brackets inside of the curly brackets. Then we're going to do comma. And then we're going to have our next placeholder. And this one, in front of that open, close curly braces, got a little ahead of myself, we're going to do city. And we're going to assign to city what? We're going to say V, open, close, square brackets, and we're going to pass in 2 here. So now we see when we print it out, it's going to get displayed as a dictionary where we have the number that is associated to that customer and then the data that is associated to that customer in list form, but it's getting stored in a dictionary. All right. So then okay, let me scroll up just to make sure everything is accurate from this. So we have use a dictionary to store it. We ask the user to enter in data. We prompt the user to enter in the specific type of data. We stored it into a list using a numeric key in the dictionary. And then we're printing out the data as a key value pair using the values to access and display each detail. And then the hint said, think about how you can access values in a list numerically. So we did all of that, but we also need to make sure if you have a little bit of extra time, this is fine. If not, it's perfectly fine as well. You do not have to do this for the exam. I know that time is of the essence, but we're just going to do function calls here just to finish off this video. So the very first thing we're going to do is collect customer data. Oops. But we did forget one thing here. So if we've created the collect customer data, which is great, we can paste it here. It's calling this function. And then the next thing we have is actually printing out customer information. So somehow we're going to get that data in there. But at the present, we don't have data inside of this main function, do we? So when we look into our collect customer and we have all this information, what is something that we could do here? Right underneath the for loop, we're going to make sure that we return data. So we're going to return the dictionary to the function calling it. And in this case, we're just going to return it to this main function. Since it's returning a value, we know that here we're going to store it in a variable called data because we're passing it as a parameter. a parameter inside of print underscore customer. So now this function is actually done correctly. Again, you don't need to section it off that way. If you're quicker, if it's easier for you to just do the code, feel free to. But at the very end here, what we're going to do is just call the main function here. And then we're done with this specific example. So I hope that this made sense for you. Feel free to let me know if there were any questions on how you did it. The quizzes are, again, a lot harder than the actual exam just to get you to see where you need to study, what you need to work on for the exam. So if you feel like I'm very unconfident with what I'm having here, then you need to make sure that you go back and review some of the concepts with key value pairs here. All right, in the next section of this video, portion of the video, I'm going to be going over quiz number 2. All right, so in this quiz, there are 5 questions available to you. And so in this section here, what we're actually going to be looking at is the first question. So we're going to define a function named greet underscore guest here. So control minus here. All right. So let's go ahead and define that. We have define greet underscore guest, open close parentheses, colon, and then we're going to enter. And I'm using shift enter to get rid of that extra space if you care and you want to do that. Then we're going to do 4 spaces in. So we've defined our function. Now it says with a default parameter name, and we're going to actually set name to guest. So the string guest is what we're actually going to be setting here. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to have name, and we're going to assign to guest, or to name guest. Now, we've already done number 1, and now we're going to move on to number 2. Inside the function, print a greeting message that includes the name. So we're going to tab in and do 4 prints, then we're going to do print. And since we want to include the name here, I'm just going to use fstring for the placeholder, or format string for the placeholder here. And I'm just going to say, let's say welcome in front of this. Welcome, and then we're going to put name as the parameter here. And make sure we put a comma. And then we're going to put an exclamation point after the name. Okay, so we have that greeting. And so the first thing we're going to do after we finished with the printing out a message that includes the name, now we're going to do our function calls. So the next thing we're going to do here is our function calls twice. So the first thing we're going to do is greet guest is what we're going to call. And it says without any argument. So we're not going to pass anything in. Now, the second one, though, we're going to say greet underscore guest. And what we're going to pass in is the string, the argument, Erica. And so now that's going to call greet guest function, passing in Erica, and it's going to replace guest. So the first time we call, it's going to print out welcome guest. The second time we call it, it's going to print out welcome Erica. So that is the structure of question number 1. So now we're going to move on to question number 2 here. Just for reiteration purposes, this is the default variable here. It gets override by the string that we pass in, or the value that we pass in here, the argument that we pass into that function. Now we're going to move on to question 2 here. We want to define a list named numbers containing the integers from 1 to 6. So let's go ahead and do that first. Numbers equals open close square brackets, and we're going to do 1, comma 2, comma 3, comma 4, 5, and 6. So we know that, hopefully you know by now what a list is. And how we create one is by using that open close square brackets there. So we've created our list. Now the next thing we have to do is use a for loop to iterate over that list. And so in that case here, we know we're going to just do for n in numbers. So remember with for loops, we can just say for every number and for every n, every item, number, element inside of the list of numbers, the next thing we're going to do is dependent on the instructions. Now inside of the loop, we're going to check if the current number is 7. If found, we're going to print out found 7 and break the loop. So how do we check if that number is 7? Well, I'll show you. 1, 2, 3, 4 space in here, and we're going to do if n is equivalent. So we're going to use our equivalent symbol, with those two equal signs here, to 7, the number 7. Then what we're going to do, and this is going to be 8 spaces, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So now inside of this if statement here, we're just going to do print, and we're going to have our quotes here, and we're just going to say found 7. And then we're going to have our closing parentheses. Then it says we need to make sure that we place a break. So we want to break out of this statement here. This may not make sense because guess what? 7 is not in that list. So it makes logic sense for us to include an else block attached to the for loop that's going to print out not found if the loop completes normally without a break. So when it says attached to the for loop, it doesn't mean here next to the for loop. It just means you're not going to need to indent out. It just needs to be inside. So it's going to be an if else statement here. So in that case, we're just going to do 1, 2, 3, 4 and have our else statement here. New line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And now inside of here, what we're going to do is have our print statement, and we're just going to say not found. So now we've finished this section. We've created our list of numbers ranging from 1 to 6, sequence of numbers. We've created our for loop that is going to check to see, or it's going to iterate through each item in that list, and we're using n as the variable storing those values. Then inside of that for loop, we're going to check to see if any of those items are equivalent to 7. If so, we can just print it out and stop the for loop. Otherwise, we're just going to print out not found. So that's question number 2. Next question here. We're going to move on to question number 3. It defines a function called print_grid that takes no parameters. So we're going to go ahead and define that real quick. Hopefully you remember seeing this from a few assignments that we've already done. So we defined this function as, what is it? Print grid. So I just put grid. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I follow the instructions to the T. Print grid. Great. It doesn't take any parameters, so that's empty. Next line, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now inside of here within the function, we're going to use 2 nested for loops. And essentially, I should have just said a nested for loop, but what I'm saying here is just 2 for loops here. And we're going to generate a 3 by 3 grid. The outer loop is going to iterate through the row, and the inner loop is going to iterate through the range. So I'm trying to give you understanding of what should get placed in there as variables. So for the very first thing here, we're going to say for every row in range, and we know that we want it to be a 3 by 3 grid. So we're going to go up to 3 here, and we're going to make that be in the range of 3. Then the next thing we're going to do is we want to do our 8 spaces. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we need to be indented in for the inner for loop. So we're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4. And then now we have our second for loop here. So we have for every column in range of, and we're going to place 3 as the parameter here with the colon. Now we're going to be making a grid just now. So we've already created a grid which has a 3 by 3. The outer iterates through the rows. We've used that as a variable. The inner iterates through columns. We've used that as a variable. Now, in the inner loop, we're going to print out asterisks followed by a space. And so you'll notice here when we zoom in a bit, we do see that there is an asterisk and there's also a space after that. So if we're going to be printing out some value with that asterisk, uh, and a space without advancing to the next line. So we know whenever we do a print statement, it does allow for us to have a new line. So the next thing we want to do is make sure that we include that end space there. So we're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's go ahead and get our print statement in there. So first things first, let's get the asterisk. So we have open, close, single quotes. We're going to place our asterisk with a space. So we've done that correct. Now the next thing, what does it say to do without advancing to the next line? So if you remember, we've used this a plethora of times throughout the semester. We're going to use end, and we're going to assign to it an extra space. So what it's going to do is it's going to give us the 3 asterisks and a space in between each. Then how we go ahead and advance to the new line is at the end of each iteration of the outer loop, we're going to print a new line to advance to the next row. And because print has a default new line in that, what we would want to do, again, we're going to go to that new line, shift enter. We're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're going to go one more in, aligning underneath the second for loop, which means that it's going to be executed after our outer for loop has gone through the first 3 asterisks. So we're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is where it means by print a new line to advance to the next row, but at the end of each iteration of the outer loop. So that's going to be aligned under here. So the next thing we're going to do is just do print, open, close parentheses, and that allows for that new line. Now, the next line here we see is call print grid to display a 3x3 grid. So in this case here, we're just going to call print underscore grid, open, close parentheses, and here we've called the grid function call here. And it's going to display a 3x3 grid. So essentially it's going to look something like this, where we have that asterisk with the space in between, and then we have that other asterisk with a space in between, then another asterisk. And because we're giving a space in between here for each new line, and this print statement, here, let me just go ahead. Because we're printing out each asterisk and we're not moving on, now when the 3 asterisks are placed in there, and we do the print, that print down here is what allows for us to go to the new line. And then we do asterisk, again, that extra space, asterisk, again, that extra space, asterisk, again, that extra space. And then we go to the new line. Asterisk, next space, asterisk, next space, asterisk, next space, and then the new line. So this is what your output would look like once you have completed, and I forgot to put an extra space down there. Yep. All right. So this is what your output would look like once it's completed. It should be 3 rows and columns of asterisks. All right, so now that we're done with this question 3, we're going to move on to question number 4. Now it wants us to define a function named displayGrid. Hey, we've already done that. Easy peasy. We're going to modify it a little bit up here, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's called print grid, but we want to display it. So we're going to go ahead and do pasting it, and we're just going to move print and put display. So we know that that's fine. Does it take any parameters? It doesn't look like it. So we're going to move on. So we have this, and now it says use a for loop to iterate through each row in the grid. Inside the row loop, use another for loop to iterate through each element in the row. Let's go ahead and try to do that right now. So here inside of this new line, we're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to do for every row in a grid that we have no ideas here. Again, just follow with instructions. Then it says inside of the row, use another for loop to iterate through each element in that row. So what we're going to do, again, another for loop, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to have 4, and we're just going to put, in this case, I don't know if you remember from the virtual pet, we did for every cell in, and we're just going to put now, instead of that, for every value, I just like to put value so you can see in row, a different way of doing it. Then we're going to tab in, and let's see what it asks us to do. After each row, or wait, print each element with end, like we did above, to avoid new lines between elements. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to print, and we're just going to print each value, and then we're going to use end, and we're going to assign that to it. Now the next thing it says to do, after each row, print a new line with print. So we're going to go ahead and do the same process. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's aligned underneath the inner for loop. So we're going to go ahead and print to give us that new line here. Now it says create a grid with predefined characters where hashtag is at position 1, 1, position 2, 2, and position 3, 3. So because we're using grid in the first for loop, that may indicate to you that we will have to create a grid inside of this function, or we can create the grid above this function, underneath this function, and call it in this function and pass it in. There's no specification. The only thing that it says is that we're using grid, and you need to make sure the grid is somewhere in your code or assumed somewhere in your code because it's asking you to create a grid. So it means you're going to need to create a grid. I'm just going to create it inside of this function here. So we're going to move up. And I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4. It should be aligned right underneath the for loop, and we're going to do grid. And we're going to assign to it a grid or a list within a list here. So if you remember when I said positioning is important, we're going to have our open square brackets and our closed square brackets. That's the first part of this. Then the next part of this is, just going to tab over here, we're going to have our first row. So I'm going to make sure that I place this here as the first one. So in position 1, 1, which is what this is here, we're going to put a hashtag. So I'm going to go ahead and put hashtag here. And then in the second position, we don't know yet, so we're just going to move on. And in the third position, we don't know yet, we're just going to move on. All right. So now we're going to do comma and move on to the second row here. We're going to have open, close square brackets here. All right. So in this first one here, it says, okay, and we don't have anything for the first one, but we know we want it for the second one because this 2 by 2 is a hashtag here. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and put hashtag right here for the second item. And we don't know yet what we would put for the third one because, again, I'm just looking at the first one that we're doing. So now we're going to press a comma and move on to the third row here. So then here, I'm just going to place inside of here the grid, process again. And I know I'm not going to need to necessarily have to do a comma here because it's the last one. So in this first parameter here, we don't have to worry about it. We don't know yet. So we're going to move on to the second. We don't know yet. And then we're going to move on to the third. All right. So now here we're at the third item. And it says here that it wants us to have the hashtag at position 3, 3. So we're going to go ahead and place the hashtag at this position here. So now we kind of see where all of these things will go. So we're just going to push it out. So we have everything a little organized to be better able to understand this. So we have hashtag at position 1, 1, hashtag at position 2, 2, hashtag at position 3, 3, meaning row 3 or row 3, column 3. row 1, column 1. This is row 1, column 1. Actually, row 1, column 1. Row 2, column 2. And pardon me, I'm not really good at drawing with this tool here. And then we have row 3, column 3. This is row 3 here. Okay. All right, so the next step here, we're looking at asterisks, is at position 1, 2. So we know that that's going to be here, row 1, and we're going to look at column 2. So here we're just going to put an asterisk, and that's for here. Now we're going to look at row 2, column 1. Row 2, column 1 would be right here, so we know we're going to put an asterisk right here. All right, and then we have row 2, column 3. So we're going to put an asterisk here. All right. Okay, so we have row 2 done. I don't think we'll need to do anything else there, but let's look at the last item. It says row 3, column 2. So we're going to put another asterisk here. All right, so now we have all of the proper items stored. Let's go ahead and fill in the blanks in the areas that aren't stored. So in row 1, column 3, there is nothing there. So we're going to go ahead and put a blank space there. All right, so we filled that in. And then again, in row 3, column 1, there is nothing there. We didn't ask you to place a position, so we're just going to put an empty position there, empty space. So now that we've filled up our 3 by 3 grid here and we've expressed how we want things to be stored, clear all the drawing items, okay. All right, the next step for us to do is just call display grid because it's not taking in any parameters here. This means that we finished this whole entire section. So now I'm going to just do a new line, call this function, but I'm not really a fan of that. So I'm just going to do display underscore grid here, open close parentheses. And here we are calling this function. And we're not passing in any values here. So this is how you would go about sifting through question 4. Now you'll notice as we progressed, slowly but surely some of the details started pulling out, but I did reinforce some of the content that hopefully you understood from the previous question. So at least if you didn't quite get the previous one, you kind of understand this one, and at least fill in the blanks where you don't. Again, try your best. Try to do what you know to do first, and then add in where you think it should be. It's better to do that than to leave things blank. All right. So here, what we're going to do, the next thing we're going to look at is going to be the global variable. Now, I said in the study guide, all you're going to have to do is identify whenever we are looking at questions like this, like the try, except, etc., the modes, as well as, try, except, identifying what each is doing. This one is, again, these questions are meant to help you go to see what you need to look up, what you need to understand, so that when the test comes around, it's a lot easier for you. So we're going to go ahead and try our hand at this. We need to define a global variable called minimum age and set it to 18. Whenever we define a global variable, we also see that it is constant because it is uppercase. So it's going to be global and constant at the very top. So here, we're going to have capitalize minimum underscore age, and we're going to assign to it 18. Next thing it wants us to do, define a function named check underscore access. Let's go ahead and do that. Define check underscore access. All right, now we've defined that function there. Let's look and see what next it asks us to do. And it's going to take one parameter, age. All right, So what is a parameter? It is a variable that is in this parameter list here. So we're going to assign age in there. Now, next item, 1, 2, 3, 4. Next thing we have to do, inside the function, use an if-else statement. If the age is less than the minimum age, raise a value error. And then display the message, access denied, you must be 18 or older, otherwise, and that otherwise hopefully will indicate to you that you need to have an else statement, or even just a print statement saying, access granted, age is valid. So let's go ahead and put that in there. So first things first, if the age is less than minimum underscore age. All right, colon. Next thing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we have that statement. The next thing it says is to do what? Raise a value error. How do we do that? We're going to do raise. And again, this is where you want to look at your Zybooks. So we have to raise it. And hopefully you are keeping up with your Zybooks. This is supposed to be where we kind of are right now. So we're going to use value, like it says in here, value error, uppercase E. And that value error actually is going to take in a value that gets displayed out as an error. So we're going to say access denied, you must be 18 or older, quotes, and then the closing parentheses here. So now this is finished, and I'm going to go ahead and actually open this up a bit since it's the last one, so we can see this a little bit better here. All right. All right. So now that we have this, we now have an otherwise statement that we have to look at. So we're going to do 2, 3, 4. And so we're going to zoom in here. And we see that it needs to be else, because that's what that otherwise is. And we're going to go onto the new line and then do 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. Let's go back one. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we're inside of that else statement. So we're just going to print out access granted, age is valid, period, and colon, and closing the print statement. So we have our if-else statement inside of our check access by age. We have used our constant global variable here to check to see if the age is less than the minimum age. We raised the value error here and passed inside of the value error function, access denied, you must be 18. We've allowed the else statement to print out access granted, age is valid. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and, oops. Okay, yep. Now we're going to go ahead and read the rest of it. It says, use a try except block to handle the user input. So in this case here, what we're going to do now is on this line down here, tab it underneath here, 4 spaces. So we're going to align it underneath that if statement here. We're going to have our try, colon, and remember I like to set up this first. So I'm going to do new line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is where the code should be added. Added here. Then the new line, 1, 2, 3, 4. And underneath this try, we're going to have except and have our colon. But inside of the except here, this is where we're going to be using that value error here. So with the except, we're saying, all right, we want to try whatever code we enter in here. If that doesn't work, we're going to make a value error exception here. So we're going to put value error as E. Now, This statement here we will get into a little bit more in a little bit. You won't necessarily see the value error, but you should have been able to at least read it since the zyBooks is due this Sunday prior to even the exam. So in this case here, that E is indicating to us that this is the information that we want to display out. We're saying the value error is going to be as E, and we're going to use that E to be able to print out that message. So on this new line here, we're going to go in the except error. We're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And inside of here, we're just going to print out a statement, and we're going to say invalid input colon quotes, and then we're going to do comma E. And because that value error message is going to get printed out here with E, it's going to print out access denied. You must be 18 or older in place of E. So E is going to hold that value because it's value error as E. Basically saying we're assigning E to this error that is basically being displayed out. All right. So now that we have finished the accept part, let's go up to the try part. And it says to convert the user input as an integer and then call the check access with this integer. So what we're going to do inside of here, get rid of that comment. And we're going to place here user underscore age. And we're going to make sure that we have input here. But in front of input, because we're checking the age as a numerical value, we need to convert it to an int. So we're going to do int, open, and then close parentheses around that. And inside of input, again, I urge you to make sure that you display to the user what they need to do. So in this case here, enter your age, colon. Now, that is going to return a string age of the user inputting it from the console or wherever they're inputting it from, and then it's converting it to an integer and storing it into user age variable. Now, on the next line, though, it says that we need to do something else with that input. So it says we have to call check access function. So we're going to highlight our function header here, and we're going to replace age with the user input. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that in there, and I'm going to make sure that age is now only going to be user underscore age, which is what the variable is storing the user's age. Then it's going to call function call, passing in the information the user entered in into this function, and then it's going to check, is the age less than 18? If so, we're going to make sure that that accept displays that value error message. Otherwise, we're just going to say access granted. Now, hopefully you were able to get somewhat of this information here. If you didn't, this is how you would go about doing it, but this was the last section of the review quiz, and these were the solutions that I have. If you did it a little bit differently, in terms of, I guess, the way that you stored this, if you just put this int input inside of here and then you call this function on one line, that's also fine to do. And that's just because here, all it asks you to do is to convert the user input to an integer and call this function. So if you wanted to put that in one line, that's also fine to do. Anyways, I hope that this video helps you understand or at least review for the quiz, and I hope that at least these two quizzes helped you see where you needed to study and where you need to work on. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know, but prepare well for the exam, and I wish you all the best on it. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end this video and have a great rest of your day.